The first valet de chambre who slept in the king's chamber called in the garçons de la chambre, who quietly opened the shutters and set the door ajar for the entrees familiar. Then the king being awake, the grand entree is summoned. The king getting out of bed, the grand chamberlain, or the first gentleman of the chamber, hands him his dressing gown. Then after intervals, all duly prescribed, the Grand Master of the Wardrobe puts on the night jacket and the blue ribbon. At each ceremony of the toilette, a corresponding entree. The first entree, or entree de brevet, entree of the ambassadeurs de famille, entree de la chambre. The fifth entree, which is performed when the king has washed his hands. The sixth entree, when his majesty has taken his shirt. It seemed as if the entrees were from one of Moliere's pieces, from one of his divertissements of the entr'actes, and that the courtiers ought to advance dancing and with graceful gestures. In truth, they almost did dance, and the whole ceremony was like an air de ballet of a religious ballet, very measured and solemn as the priests of all religions dance before their idols. It is a special prerogative to pour spirits of wine on the hands of the king, or to hand him the holy water vase to undo the right or left sleeve of his nightshirt. It is an honor to pass the king his shirt, an honor which it first fell to the sons or the grandsons of France, then to the princes of the blood, then to legitimate princes. Only in default of these two, the grand chamberlain, afterwards following the order of rank, to the first gentleman of the chamber, to the Grand Master of the Robes, to the Master of the Robes, to the officers of the wardrobe, each in his order, and his shirt warmed, covered with white taffeta. It is according to the rank of him who is to give it, presented by such a person whose duty it is, taken in the prescribed manner, so that the king, behind his dressing gown, held up by two valets de chambre to conceal him from observation, may be left to shiver, while such a one, coming into the room, draws off his gloves and puts himself into the posture of waiting on him. Imagine Napoleon, subject to such constraint, and waiting like this for his shirt. If even his inclination would allow him to submit to such trifles, how could he find the time? His life is far too much taken up by work to allow him to waste hours every day. Besides, in his palace still riddled with the bullets of August 10th, where the floor is still red with the blood of the murdered Swiss and gentlemen, how was it possible to take up the whole of the cast-off clothes? A king's. Are there not patches which on them keep up a traditional majesty, which on another would look like the disguise for a carnival? For such ceremonies to make any impression, to provoke respect, to assure the dignity of the throne, or at least to retain the seriousness and to be received in that spirit, they must have some sense. They must be found in tradition. They must call up old memories. In this case, there's nothing of the kind. No tradition save that of the Bourbons. No memories apart from theirs. Nothing which in itself can belong to the new dynasty. For the establishment of a form of worship, priests must be found, and these priests must have faith in the religion, the mysteries of which they celebrate. It was impossible for Napoleon to have that inward assurance of his sovereignty which was possessed by the kings descended from Hugh Capet. In his case, etiquette was a necessity of the monarchy, but could not be an article of faith. As it applies to himself, it is an organization which he insists on, a law which he enacts. But how many enactments have fallen into oblivion in 10 years? How many laws have been revoked? The etiquette which he proposes to lay down will be obeyed for forces on his side, but it cannot be respected. The men who have sprung from the revolution will take it seriously as far as it affects themselves, but in no respect as it affects others. The men of the ancien regime will see in it only a parody of that which has passed away. It will not even be in their eyes an etiquette in the proper sense, that is to say, code ceremonial, each clause of which is constituted by a precedent, each precept justified by an example. It is simply an order which will last as long as he who gave it. To restore the ceremonial of the monarchy and its integrity was not to be thought of. Not that Napoleon feared by adopting it to render himself ridiculous. He had no sense of the ridiculous. He said himself, power is never ridiculous. He would not restore it because it would worry him, and moreover, he could not, because he was not surrounded by a large number of persons necessary to carry it out in such a manner that he might not be inferior to the ancient kings. His companions in arms do not excel in such duties. Their rides through Europe with death on the crupper had not given their backs sufficient suppleness for the duties of the antechamber. They knew not how to fulfill them, and committed all sorts of blunders. It is from birth itself that such habits are acquired, and the whole education must be given with that object. Even those younger men who have not arrived at the highest rank and who up till now form the consular family, men of dexterity and men of brains, are almost useless for it, without looking at their origin, without troubling himself from what stock they issued and from what college. Bonaparte recruited them by the chance of the times for their good looks, because he had seen that they were brave, intelligent, and honest. These at the siege of Toulon, those on the day of Vendemiaire, some of the staff of Berthier, others at the battlefields of Marengo. A few are noble, but very few, and of the small nobility who would never approach the court. One alone is a good family, but it is precisely his name, much more than his military reputation, which caused his promotion to the staff in the days of the consulate. As for the prefects of the palace, whom he appointed about the same time to do the honors of his receptions and to take care of the contents of the palace, they were but simple majordomos of a position a little better than servants, but of whom the best connected were members of some family of finance, while those best instructed in etiquette had already filled some menial office in the royal court, some purchased place which allowed them to add to their patronymic the title of some estate, and at the end of 2 or 3 generations to deck themselves out with an assumed title and with a name to which they had no right. The great nobles, really of ancient nobility and really of the exalted race, who had been the grand officers of the crown of France, were not to be thought of. Those who had not perished on the scaffold remained in exile, religiously faithful to their deposed but not a crowned king. The grand almoner of France, the Cardinal of Montmorency, Laval, lived at Altona. It was useless to speak the Grand Master, the Prince Condé, of the Grand Chamberlain, the Prince de Guémené, of the Master of the Horse, the Prince de Lambesc, of the Master of the Hunt, the Duke Ponthièvre, princes of the royal blood, or of the House of Lorraine. The Grand Butler, the Marquis of Verneuil, was dead. The Grand Pander, the Duke de Brissac, had been murdered. The Grand Falconer, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, was by the king's side. The Grand Master of the Wolfhounds, the Comte d'Auceneville, had scarcely returned from emigration. He died in 1806, and it was only 4 years later, in 1810, that his son offered himself as chamberlain. There were no first gentlemen of the chamber, no captains of the guards, no governors of the royal houses. None of those were to be found strolling about the Tuileries in the year 7, neither Richelieu nor Durfort, nor Aumont, nor Fleury, nor Noailles, nor Luxembourg, nor Despois, more than is supposed. The high nobility remained faithful to its masters for appearance's sake. Napoleon was able later to recruit few starving younger sons, but the heads of the names and arms of those who had charge of the family he could not have gained over so soon, even if he could ever have done so without the unremitting participation of this illustrious body. The restoration of the ancient etiquette was impossible. These men alone possessed the secrets of it. They alone knew the details. Alone they had succeeded for ages in placing themselves between the kings and the people without a murmur from the latter, because the people knew that they were illustrious and that the splendor of their services exalted the majesty of the throne.